I live in a duplex in a small community. For over a year, life had been uneventful, with nothing much to complain about. The neighbors sharing a wall with me had moved out only a month after I moved in, and since then, their side remained vacant. It almost felt like I had the entire place to myself. One night, after a long shift at work, I picked up some fast food and returned home. I settled on the couch, turned on the TV, and began to eat. But as I savored my meal, a quiet thud came from behind me. Startled, I turned around, staring at the wall that separated my duplex from the empty one. The thud happened again. I muted the TV and approached the window, peering outside into the dark driveway. There were no cars, no moving trucks, and the lights in the neighboring unit were off. Puzzled, I pressed my ear against the wall. Muffled but distinct, I heard soft footsteps and the creaking of doors opening and closing, as if someone were meticulously inspecting the place. My mind raced. That duplex had been empty for over a year, and it was almost 11 p.m. This was highly unusual. After a few minutes of listening, I decided there was nothing more I could do. I returned to the couch, trying to focus on the TV. I stayed up until about 1 a.m. before heading to bed. Sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, the unsettling noise echoing in my mind. Suddenly, the same thud reverberated through the house, this time much louder. I sat up, my heart pounding. The thud was followed by soft footsteps moving downstairs. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped away from the bed and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. With the volume turned down low, I whispered my address to the 911 operator, trying to explain the situation. As I spoke, a shadow appeared under my bedroom door. My voice caught in my throat. Whoever was in my house was just outside my door, their footsteps cautious but deliberate, moving back and forth in the hallway. I held my breath, praying the police would arrive quickly. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, the intruder's footsteps grew louder and more purposeful. They no longer cared about stealth. They moved quickly, opening doors to other rooms. When they reached my door, the handle twisted, the intruder trying to force it open. My heart pounded in my chest. Thankfully, they gave up after a few attempts and moved downstairs, continuing their search before leaving the unit. The police arrived shortly after, but the intruder was gone. They had taken a few things, but it was clear they knew I was there. Their behavior suggested they were searching for something specific. A few weeks later, I discovered a small camera hidden under a nightstand in the spare bedroom. I handed it over to the police, but they couldn't trace its origin or retrieve any data from it. To this day, I don't know if they were spying on me or had more sinister intentions. It's been months since that night, and there have been no signs of their return. But the thought lingers in my mind, if they came back, I might not even know until it's too late. In 2019, I decided to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and retreat to a secluded Airbnb cabin in northern Wisconsin. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, right by the Canada-US border. It was part of a park filled with similar rustic retreats, each one isolated, owned by the same person. Despite the cabin's remote location, it was only a 10-minute drive from the nearest store. Yet, the immediate surroundings were eerily quiet, each cabin accessible only by its own winding trail that snaked through dense trees. For the first couple of days, I reveled in the solitude, enjoying the peace and tranquility. I spent my time indoors reading or wandering the forest trails, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the third day, however, the isolation began to feel oppressive. The silence seemed to press in on me, and the once charming seclusion turned into a sense of eerie loneliness. I craved human interaction and decided to visit the park center, a communal area with charcoal grills, fire pits, and benches where other guests often gathered. As I made my way to the park center around 5 p.m., the sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm golden hue over the trees. Upon arrival, I quickly made friends with a couple of guys who were already there. We shared beers and swapped stories around the fire pit, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that flickered in the growing twilight. The camaraderie was a welcome relief from the loneliness of the past few days. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into deepening darkness. A stranger appeared out of the shadows and joined our circle. We welcomed him, offering him a drink, but something about him immediately felt off. He was taciturn, his eyes hollow and his demeanor unsettling. He looked out of place, exhausted and unhappy in what was supposed to be a vacation spot. His presence cast a pall over the evening. Despite his obvious discomfort, none of us had the heart to ask him to leave. One by one, my new friends trickled away, leaving me alone with the stranger. I stood up, doused the fire, and announced my intention to head back to my cabin. He remained seated, his gaze fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. As I walked down the trail to my cabin, I glanced back several times, each time catching him watching me until he quickly averted his gaze. The path was dimly lit by sparse outdoor lamps, casting ominous shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe as I hurried back to the cabin, hoping he wasn't following me. Inside, I tried to shake off the unease. I took a quick shower and then sat in the living room, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Despite the few beers I had earlier, sleep came slowly. When I finally drifted off, it felt like only moments had passed before I awoke with a start. The cabin was pitch dark, save for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. Disoriented, I glanced at the clock, its red digits glowing faintly. A sense of unease washed over me, and I instinctively felt I wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a figure standing in the open doorway of my bedroom. The man was silhouetted against the faint moonlight, his features obscured. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized the shape and stance. It was the stranger from the fire pit. He stood there, silent and menacing. My mind raced, paralyzed with fear, as he finally spoke in a broken, harsh voice, "I need to stay here." My voice caught in my throat. I managed to stammer out a confused response, but he repeated himself, louder and more forceful. "I need to stay here." His tone was desperate, yet commanding, and I could tell he was unhinged and unpredictable. Carefully, I rose from my bed, trying not to provoke him. As my eyes adjusted further, I saw his face more clearly. He looked even more exhausted and frantic than before, sweat dripping down his temples. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then he stepped back into the hallway, pressing himself against the wall as if to give me room to pass. His left hand was held stiffly at his side, concealing something. Summoning all my courage, I edged past him. As I turned the corner, I glanced back to see him still standing there, eyes fixed on me. I bolted outside, sprinting down the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The path stretched on forever, each step echoing in the silence. By sheer luck, a group was still gathered at the park center, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to my terror. I burst into the clearing, breathless and frantic, explaining what had happened. They quickly called 911, and within minutes, the police arrived. The officers moved cautiously down the trail to my cabin, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found the man in the hallway, clutching a knife in his left hand. His eyes were wild, and he muttered incoherently as they restrained him. At the station, his rambling answers and erratic behavior were chalked up to insanity. He was clearly disturbed, but I was just grateful he had let me go without further harm. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. The man's haunted eyes and desperate voice replayed in my mind. I still shudder to think what might have happened if he hadn't let me go. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat, was now tainted by the memory of that terrifying night. I left northern Wisconsin the next day, vowing never to return. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and it was October of last year when it happened. The weather had turned colder, and we were in the middle of a relentless storm. I didn't mind much since I was working from home, but the constant rain and oppressive clouds created a gloomy atmosphere. I started my day early, diving into work, but around 1 p.m. my Zoom meeting was abruptly interrupted as the power went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, not just my computer. I grabbed my phone, using it as a makeshift flashlight, and hurried to the window. Outside it was dim, the heavy rain obscuring much of the daylight, but I could see that my neighbors' houses still had their lights on. Anxiety gnawed at me. Something was wrong with my house. I grabbed a more substantial flashlight and headed to the unfinished basement. Navigating through the stacked storage boxes, I reached the electrical panel. The main power switch was flipped to the off position, which struck me as odd. Usually the switches would be loose, not fully flipped. I pushed it back to the on position, and the house lit up again. I returned to my office waiting for the internet to reconnect, and resumed my work. I worked late, preparing for a presentation, not closing my computer until 8 p.m. The storm raged on and it was now pitch dark outside. Lightning sporadically illuminated my room. As I left my office, I heard bumps coming from downstairs. I brushed it off as the wind or something hitting the house, but as I descended the stairs, the power cut out again. This time it startled me more. I stood there listening intently. The house was eerily silent, except for the storm outside. Even the bumps had ceased. I retrieved my flashlight and cautiously approached the basement door. As I descended the steps, the storm's roar grew louder, reverberating through the basement. I shined my flashlight around, heading for the electrical panel. But then I saw a puddle of water on the floor. My heart pounded as I shone the light further, revealing more wet spots and leading to a stack of boxes beneath an open window well. Water streamed down the wall, and atop the boxes there were muddy shoe prints. Someone had used them as a makeshift ladder to climb in and out. Panic surged through me. I spun around, sweeping the light across the basement, terrified that someone was hiding among the boxes, watching me. I bolted up the stairs, my pulse racing, grabbed my keys, and locked myself in my car. With shaking hands, I called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes, searched the house, but found no one. However, they confirmed a break-in, pointing out the unscrewed window well. They secured it to prevent further flooding. After giving my statement, they told me to update them if anything else happened. The most unsettling part? Whoever cut the power earlier had likely been in the basement with me, hidden in the darkness just a few feet away. The intruder might have been in my house for hours, and I still have no idea who they were or what they wanted. The terror of that night lingers, knowing they were so close, watching, waiting.